we're going to delve into VivaCitadel,
Yeah.
which is our product that we're developing for the intelligent city and living lab space.
Correct.
And you just so happen to be the right man to talk to about that.
I sure hope so.
So perhaps you could just firstly tell me what is VivaCitadel and what we hope it can do.
Yeah, definitely. I think the easiest way to think about what VivaCitadel is and what we hope it can do is to think of a city, right? Like imagine the city and its employees, they're offering a bunch of different services, right? The city is responsible for maintaining its roads, its sewer infrastructure. There's a ton of parks that they need to keep up with. There's a lot of things that are physical that are going on, but there's also a number of services, right? Both for citizens, like paying your tickets or, applying for a business license or stuff like that. But then internally also, these people need computers and those computers need to work in order for those people to be able to do the work that they need to do. So the point being, cities are incredibly diverse in terms of what an actual day-to-day might look like for any given employee, right? It's so broad. And yet, as technology continues to evolve and things like, AI start to become more and more a topic, a lot is said about data, right? And making data-driven decisions. That tends to be a bit of a buzz phrase, if you will, that we hear a lot. And VivaCitadel is trying to play in this space in the following way. Let's imagine you're an employee and you need to make a decision about, let's say, how often would you like to irrigate the soccer fields in the city? Well, you need to make that decision and you could just take a guess, right? And just like, well, it's a little too much right now, so I'll decrease it a bit and hope for the best, or I'll increase it a bit if it's too low. But ultimately, if you want to, make a data-driven decision, you are somebody who's in need of some data, right? What's our state of our soccer fields, right? Are there soccer fields that require less irrigation, others that require more? Perhaps there's areas where there's more rain, and there's just a number of information items that you might need in order to make that decision as best you can. And yet, if you're a city employee, the process whereby you need to find that data is pretty ill-defined. Like it's very human oriented in the sense that you would need to find people and start shooting some emails and start escalating things throughout the organization to try and find somebody who might have a data set on rainfall data for particular areas, or even the specific locations of all of the soccer fields in the city and all of that stuff. And this problem compounds if you're somebody who's a little bit higher level in terms of strategic direction setting in the city, where you might have to look at a number of areas. It's not just soccer fields, but all of a sudden it's all of the parks and it's all of the infrastructure, and it's thinking of, what do the water lines look like, so that we can, where would it be feasible for us to change the irrigation system, for example. So the more high level you are, the more vast the pool of data that may be of use to you is. The other problem with the city being so diverse with these different services is that cities typically, they're such large organizations that they end up with these different silos, right? You've got the people who look after infrastructure, you've got the people who look after parks, you've got the people who look after IT. And that spans across several different lines of business and throughout the different departments of the city. Now, historically, these people have all solved their tech and data problems with their own solutions, right? So you, in operations, you have your problems and you'll procure your own solutions and you figure that out. And then you in IT will do the same for your problems. But when you're looking at these issues that are pretty holistic, right? Not just things like strategic direction setting for the city, but when you think of wicked societal problems, right? Climate change and stuff none of us can meaningfully solve world hunger, climate change, like big problems like that. And they're multifaceted. So you need these different silos of information to somehow talk to one another. And that doesn't exist today. It costs cities a ton of money to have people navigate through these internal channels. There's a ton of resistance there. And it's just missed opportunity for innovation and, taxpayer money eventually going to, just waste in that sense of processes that repeat and that are cumbersome. So what VivaCitadel is trying to do is it's trying to come in and be a single, easy-to-use, searchable interface that can connect all these different silos, right? So you've got data on a number of areas across the city, and instead of having to, escalate and send out emails or whatever, you just look it up on Citadel, and out comes all of the search results for these different sources of data, whether it's spatial data, whether it's reports or documents or anything like that. You can search for it in a single place and you can see your results. You can access it then and there. You can, if there's more sensitive information, you might need to proceed with some direct access instructions. But the point being, there's a single source of truth for all this stuff now. And that's what I think, just speaking with our potential users and clients over the last few months, that's been the most game-changing part. I mean, imagine being able to search all of your different SharePoint sites and all of your OneDrives and all of your everythings all at once. For an organization, that seems to be a fairly significant value prop, or so we're told so far. There's a second element of Citadel, though, which is now that you've got this kind of almost your phone book for data, right? Where it is, how do you get it, right? All of that in a single interface. We've seen a lot of push from cities to try and give that back to the community, right? Like, this is probably useful for other people beyond the limits of City Hall necessarily. And so turning that back to the community and trying to create some opportunities for innovation, right? Working with universities, as you've mentioned, in Kamloops and those resources, and trying to maximize their effectiveness and give them good data so they can do good work and co-create solutions that can impact the whole community. This is what we like to call living labs, and it's what generally it's being called out there. But it's this idea of creating sustainable impact and allowing the community to have input and different stakeholders from different areas like universities and cities and citizens themselves and business owners to all come together and co-create solutions to these very difficult to solve wicked problems, really. And so that's a really neat part about Citadel, is not only does it solve a problem that exists today for cities in terms of efficiencies, data visibility, data governance, and all those things, it also creates a foundation for a future that I think sounds really exciting to me. It sounds like a future that I'd like to be in. And so, yeah, that's a little bit more about Citadel.
So let's go build it.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, VivaCitadel, it's a web-based platform. Mm-hmm. And if you could just sum up very quickly into 2 or 3 bullet points about what it hopes to achieve, perhaps you could do that.
Yeah, for sure. I think first bullet point, single search interface for all the data repositories across the city. I think that's really the key driver of what we're trying to build is to, this is the missing piece so far, right? There's a ton of inventories for these individual silos, but single search interface for all of the silos. I think that's critical. I think the second part that's critical to VivaCitadel is the ability for the city to retain control of who has access to these things, right? Not only internally, because even if information isn't legally speaking private, it may be considered sensitive. And so the city needs to be able to retain these permissions. And when we're talking about external access too, right? That's huge. And so allowing the cities to do that from a central location, definitely big as well. And I would say a third very important bullet is the ability to generate non-tax revenue, right? Most of the people that we speak to, that we have spoken to within cities so far, they've brought up the problem around resourcing, right? Talent, especially in the technology space, and people who can drive forward sort of these more innovative projects. It's not cheap, it's not plentiful, and it can be hard to attract when you're kind of a rigid public entity, right? You're bound by a number of rules and regulations. And so trying to create an opportunity for the city to generate revenue through value-added services beyond just charging citizens more and more tax, that creates opportunities to not only fund some very interesting initiatives and help maybe in some ways address the resource issue that we see in cities, but also from a strategic perspective, it helps to position the people who do all this technology work and the people who are running your intelligent cities or even your information services, your IT departments, to position them as true value adders to the organization and help perhaps break some of that older stigma that can be attached to IT departments where, they're kind of a silent partner. You call them if something breaks, and you only are aware of them when something isn't right? So to use technology to do positive things. Generating non-tax revenue in that way.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
how did we get here? And why are we focused on municipalities, communities in general, small governments? Talk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, great question. I think I'll tackle the latter portion of that first. So why municipalities and small governments? And I think it all goes back to we like doing projects that have a soul behind them, or so we say, in the sense that, we would love to get up in the morning to do something that we feel is meaningful to the community as a whole, right? It's more than just a job or a cycle that repeats and affords you the opportunity to do other things that you enjoy in life once you're done, right? And so I think working with cities and First Nations organizations and small government is really an opportunity for us to keep focusing on this side of what we do. These are organizations that inevitably by nature, they have a reach that, spans perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, right? When you think of cities. And being able to support these organizations inevitably has some trickle-down effects that affect all of these community members. And so I think, from my perspective, why I enjoy the fact that we focus on these organizations a lot, that would be around, just the impact that we're able to have, directly or indirectly, in terms of trying to, leave our mark in the world and do something the right way. And how we got here has been a bit of a windy road, hasn't it? I think we were lucky, as you mentioned, when you founded VivaCitadel, that the city of Kamloops was our first client and they were on board. And then I think organically, it would have made a ton of sense for us to grow out in this direction, beyond all the soul elements that I just spoke about, but purely from a pragmatic, business standpoint of our shortest path to revenue. And in terms of, getting to building VivaCitadel, we went through public key infrastructure, which is another area that we work with at VivaCitadel, and then, looking at certificate authorities, digital certificates, and the security of device-to-device or machine-to-machine communication. And I think from then we started, looking at, okay, how can we apply this to something that does have a bit of a soul and where there's more of an opportunity for a startup to really shine. And that prompted us to look at IoT, knowing who our clients were. Obviously, looking at smart cities made a ton of sense. And then a few projects here and there that helped us continue to explore this direction and add some value while we were funding our continued research and then product development. And then most recently, I guess, learning that IoT really isn't today a huge issue for most cities, right? We think that it's going to be over the coming years, especially if we look at all the smart and intelligent city strategies, and if we expect those visions to sort of materialize over time. That's been the most recent evolution, I think, is just looking at the problem of somebody who needs to access data and some data that lives somewhere, and then trying to create somewhat of a beaten path between the two that's easy to find and navigate. So I guess that's, summing up a very, very long and nuanced story into something that hopefully makes some sense. So,
appreciate that. I mean, I've been told many times, why are you selling into the municipality space? Like small governments, there's a procurement process, it's hard, it's long, it's drawn out. Why are we going after this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, look, first of all, we're still afloat, right? That's the space that we've worked with. And I think if it were true that it's incredibly difficult and really hard to sell to and hard to, get your foot in the door or to establish yourself, we wouldn't be here sitting having this conversation right now, right? So I think that there's an element of, perhaps too much of a horror story around what the process is actually like. And yes, it's cumbersome. Yes, it's challenging, but I think that there's definitely pros and cons and perhaps a little bit too much focus on the con side of things, just broadly speaking. And I'd say the second part of it is just tying back to what I just said about things that have a soul and ways where we can leave a meaningful mark in our community in a positive way, and just really trying to do our best to contribute to building a world that we would like to live in, or we would like future generations to live in. And I just feel like that's difficult to do when you're doing work, even as a consultant, to a private commercial organization, maybe, think of a large company listed in the stock market or whatever, where it's basically a cash making machine. It's optimized and it's oiled in a way to maximize shareholder value, right? And that's great. But when you're looking for a soul and you're looking for a project that allows you to really build something that's meaningful and of value to a community as a whole, I think that's just not the space that is most conducive to that, right? That would be the space we're in, which is working with cities and working with First Nations organizations. And yeah, it's hard, but it's also meaningful, right? I would have a much harder time, I think, waking up in the morning and motivating myself to go to work and continue to challenge myself and to learn and to build a team and to navigate all these paths if there wasn't such a cool opportunity to do something that I actually care about in the process, and that's why I think we keep working with the space. No shortage of challenges anywhere we would choose to work in, but these are the more meaningful challenges to us, I think.
Awesome. Well, I feel lucky to work with you.
Likewise.
So we're currently going through the process of building out our MVP.
Yes.
Tell me what this first version MVP will offer and be like for our clients.
Yeah, good question. I think something that's really important to just get out there is that our MVP is probably going to be bad in a number of ways. I think any good MVP, in the sense of the word, is probably really bad. There's this example that I've heard before where, when you're building a product, you want to find a problem that is basically like people having their hair on fire, where it's really uncomfortable and you really need to solve it. And if your hair is on fire, and I were to build an MVP to solve that, most people might say, well, just, a glass of water or a bucket of water or a hose or something along those lines. But that's not true. Like, an MVP, when your hair is on fire, is like, here, take this brick, and if your hair is actually on fire, you would gladly take that brick and start going like, please get this off me, right? So I think there's a real art in terms of trying to build an MVP, knowing that it's going to be horrible in many ways. But the key point of it is trying to validate, like, is this enough of a hair on fire thing where you're willing to bash your head in with a brick in the process of trying to find some solution to it? And I think we've definitely hit that with this direction that we're going in for the VivaCitadel MVP. Now, what the MVP is focused around is going back to somebody who needs data and some data that lives somewhere, building somewhat of a beaten path between these two. And our focus for that is going to be initially around SharePoint. So SharePoint, document management system, right? Big Microsoft product. Most of the cities that we're aware of are Microsoft or Azure shops. So it makes a ton of sense to start there. And using this product ourselves, I mean, some of the consulting work that we do with First Nations organizations is around sort of, helping them migrate to one of these solutions and helping to put that in place from the start. Looking at what it offers, it's almost built with silos in mind, right? You get to build these different sites and these different things so that you can control who has access to what. And I think that makes a ton of sense. But what we're trying to do is kind of undo that in a controlled and managed way, whereby we can conglomerate or get these different silos together so that you can have an initial point for your search, right? So basically, for the MVP, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at several resources scattered around several different SharePoint sites in no particular great state of organization, and providing our MVP users with the ability to search for resources within all of those in one place.
Awesome. And I assume we're not endorsing people hitting themselves over the head with a brick.
No, I would not recommend.
Okay.
Yes.
Just check. Good. Key lessons. What have we learned along the way, and how might have you done things differently if we could go back?
That's deep. I think the first lesson that I learned, the first lesson that comes to mind, probably not the first one that I've learned, as this is a bit more recent, but it's that people are good. And because people are good, they'll lie to you a lot, especially when you're trying to build a product. Mm-hmm. So I think something that we did a lot of over time was to just try to the best way we could, share the vision for what we had, and then elicit some feedback for that vision. And I think that led us down some very unproductive paths for several months, because people were good and they were nice to us, but they were lying. Not because they were trying to, but they, it's just your instinct, right? If it's kind of like if you have a friend who has something on their tooth, like, are you going to tell them, or like, do you not? Or somebody who has bad breath, like, how do you deal with that, right? So that element of human nature, I think learning how to navigate it in a way where we can really nail down what's good feedback and what's just fluff. Building out that skill set probably has been one of the biggest learning experiences. And actually, great book that he recommended and that we read, The Mum Test. The author's name escapes me right now, but it's essentially around this entire concept of, how do you have these conversations with users? How do you get good feedback when people are good and therefore they lie to you? So that was a very interesting skill set to build. And I think the other core area of learning, I think, is it's impossible to be a perfectionist and to work at a startup, like to try and build a product like this. I think being comfortable with the fact that even though what we're building isn't perfect right off the bat, we're on the right track and this is meaningful, not only for us as an organization, but I feel like for us as engineers individually speaking. There's always a tendency of, I need to build this to the best spec that I can and this needs to perform. And when you're a startup, those aren't really the questions that you need to answer at first, right? There's other things that will kill you more quickly than whether or not your app can handle 1 million concurrent requests without a hitch, right? Mm-hmm. To get to 1 million concurrent requests without a hitch, you must have done lots of other things right before then.
Yeah.
And so, I think giving up that perfectionist nature and really understanding this process of how do you prioritize, how much time you're going to be spending doing what and at what stage, probably two of the bigger learning areas over the last several months.
Okay. So, trying to figure out how we can stop people lying from us sounds like a worthy goal. So, glad we've gone down that path and definitely solved a few issues by learning more along that way. One of the things you and I talk a lot about is around failure and being more acceptance of the fact that we're going to fail and we're going to do things wrong and being okay with that. How do you feel like we've embraced that more so over the last few months and becoming more comfortable with that concept?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think overall, like, you're a very failure-oriented CEO in the best sense of the word, in which, by that I mean, I feel probably worse if I come to you saying that I've made no mistakes than if I come to you saying, hey, I made a mistake, but here's what I learned, right? And I feel like you project that expectation across all of us. I feel like when we started, although you and I probably have a little bit more, shared understanding of this focus around let's make more mistakes, let's try new things, let's learn new things, to convey that to a whole team of people who, like, inevitably they depend on VivaCitadel, it's our job to be here and to be doing these things. And it's really scary for you to go out there and push yourself to make mistakes when perhaps you might not be fully sure or have the same awareness that perhaps you and I might have around making mistakes being good and something that we want to do more of. And I think over the last several months, that's just something that I personally have tried to work on and model a lot more, and just try and lead by example in that way of, trying to, make more mistakes with what we do and push ourselves to, instead of halting what I'm doing and blocking my entire team in order to ask you a question so that if anything goes wrong, my neck isn't on the line. I think moving from that paradigm to, oh shoot, George is really busy. I don't think there's a good answer to this question. I'm just going to give it a go and I'm going to see what happens, right? I think, doing more and more of that has been really helpful for me to really consolidate this understanding of it's not only, words coming out of George's mouth in the sense of let's make more mistakes. It's actually, let's give the team opportunities to, have agency and use critical thinking and just do the best you can. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you'll either get it right, in which case that's great, or you'll get it wrong and you'll learn a bunch, which is also great in the long term, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think keeping that more in mind and trying to make more mistakes consciously, yeah, that's how I've seen things evolve over the last few months.
Awesome. Sounds like a win-win-win.
Yeah.